You're about to hear the 10th episode of the Groundless Ground podcast. And I wanted to just take a minute to thank every one of you who are listening, especially those of you who've reached out to send comments and lend your support. I really appreciate it. And you know, I'm having a lot of fun. Whatever podcast app you're listening to the Groundless Ground on, write a review. Give it stars. I know stars are silly. The thing is, more stars, people find podcasts like this. Thank you one and all, and here's to more great podcasting. Welcome back to the Groundless Ground podcast, the leading edge of mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. Remember, you can now subscribe to and download the Groundless Ground on your favorite podcast app or listen on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn. Evan Thompson is a writer and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He works on the nature of mind, the self, and human experience. Evan's work has always combined cognitive science, philosophy of mind, phenomenology, and cross-cultural philosophy, especially Asian philosophical traditions. He really is one of a kind in the philosophy world, and his books reflect that. What better person to dive deeply into the philosophical and scientific exploration of the embodied mind and what's now called embodied cognition. Evan, it is an honor to have you here. You're so generous. You're such a busy guy. I can't believe you're making time.
Thank you for inviting me to have the conversation. It's great to be here.
I just want to begin by affirming the interdependence of philosophy and psychology. Two disciplines, I believe, rely deeply upon one another and yet often don't encourage their adherents to actually study one another. I'm hoping this episode will be an antidote to that problem and maybe even stimulate mental health professionals to get interested in the philosophical study of mind, especially organismic conceptions of consciousness.
Philosophy was the origin originally of psychology. Historically speaking, it gave birth to psychology, so it's good for them to stay very much in touch with each other.
I actually think it's okay for you to mention William James because I think most mental health professionals have no idea that psychology originated in philosophy.
Yeah, William James, was one of those amazing figures who was a philosopher and a psychologist, and he had medical training as an anatomist and physiologist, and his book, The Principles of Psychology, 2-volume work published, I think it was 1890. It just covers every topic that we're still talking about today. And he knew about Buddhism and had an interest in Asian philosophical and psychological frameworks.
Maybe we'd start by letting the listeners get to know you a little bit. You had a very unusual childhood. You were raised at Lindisfarne, which was a contemplative educational community found by your parents, Gail Thompson and William Irwin Thompson, the social philosopher, author, and critic. I actually had an academic crush on your dad in 1982 when I read Time Falling Bodies Take to Light.
Oh, great.
I never thought all these years later I would know his son.
Right. Small world, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what it was like to be raised at Lindisfarne.
My dad and William Irwin Thompson and my mother, Gail Thompson, they founded the Lindisfarne Association in 1973, I think it was. And my dad was a university professor before that. He was a tenured full professor at York University in Toronto, and he came to a point where he felt that the universities weren't really teaching or presenting a worldview that was adequate to the times that we were finding ourselves in. He quit his position, and this was in Canada, in Toronto, and we moved down to Long Island in New York. And he set up an alternative educational institute that was also run in very 1970s fashion as an intentional community. And the idea was really to bring together a whole range of scientists, especially scientists then who were very much concerned with ecology and environmentalism, but also scientists just interested in the big picture of the universe, life, mind, to bring them into engagement with contemplative teachers, spiritual teachers from different religious traditions, also to bring those groups into engagement with people who were involved in political activism and community building, and also artists, poets, and painters. The community was run in a way where there would be courses and classes and study groups in all these different areas. Then there'd be periods of work during the day and meditation practice during the day. So it was a community of people living together, practicing meditation and having a school for the kids who lived there, including me. And then during the year, there would be these different conferences that would bring together people from all these different areas. So I grew up in that environment. I was homeschooled in it before there was really the word homeschooling. So as a result, I was exposed to a lot of different perspectives across philosophy and science and religion and contemplative practice. And that was where I met Francisco Varela, the neuroscientist who also really pioneered the discussion between science and Buddhism. And he lived with us for a number of months as a scholar in residence and kind of became a family member and a teacher, kind of older brother teacher to me. As a result of that, after I had gone away to college and then eventually gotten my PhD in philosophy, we worked together a lot while I was a graduate student and afterwards, really up to the time of his death in 2001.
How old were you when you met Francisco?
So I would have been 14 when I met him. Lindisfarne, as I said, was originally on Long Island in Southampton, but at one point we had both a place in Manhattan and also the place in Southampton. And so I remember meeting Francisco because he was coming to a conference that we were having in Southampton. He was living in Boulder then, and he arrived in New York, and we drove together with my dad out to Southampton. And so the first conversation I had with him was in a car on the Long Island Expressway out to Southampton. Yeah, I was about 14, I guess.
Do you feel like your upbringing fueled your love of philosophy of mind and particularly this integration of cognitive science and philosophy?
Yeah, definitely. I was always around philosophical ideas, scientific ideas. Actually, eventually, when I went away to college, what I was really interested in was Asian philosophy. So my undergraduate degree was in Asian studies. It was in Chinese language and Chinese history and a lot of study of Buddhism. And I studied with Bob Thurman, who was a professor at Amherst College where I went at the time. And I had met him through Lindisfarne as well. He had come to Lindisfarne in 1976 to be a translator for 2 Tibetan lamas. So it was actually really Asian philosophy that I was first interested in, but I had always, been aware of these larger discussions of Asian philosophical traditions and Western philosophy and dialogue with science, and that sort of shaped how I saw everything. But my first degree was in Asian studies and Asian philosophy, and then I decided to go on in grad school to get my degree in philosophy, and it was at that point that I really got drawn into cognitive science and specifically into issues about, the mind and the brain and the body. As a result of that, Francisco Varela invited me to come work with him in Paris because he wanted to write a book about Buddhist philosophy and cognitive science. And he knew that I had this undergraduate training in Asian studies and Buddhist studies, and that I was working as a grad student in cognitive science and philosophy. So he brought me over to Paris one summer to work. This was 1986, basically working on a transcript of a series of lectures he had given on Buddhism and cognitive science. And that was really the start of our book, The Embodied Mind, that was published in 1991.
And I'd say the germ of embodied neuroscience as well.
Yeah, a lot of ideas about embodied cognition. In that book, we pulled together a number of ideas and things that were happening in cognitive science at that time that were sort of under this heading of embodied cognition, but hadn't quite yet crystallized into the embodied cognition paradigm, you could say, or what we called enactive cognition. That was our particular term for the approach that we were taking.
Before we launch into our discussion of embodied cognition, I'd love to give you a chance to share what area of inquiry is currently exciting you.
I'm working on a bunch of different things, actually, maybe too many at once. One book I'm writing that's under contract and I'm trying to finish now is actually about the Buddhism mind science dialogue as it's evolved really over the past 15 years, especially through work by the Mind and Life Institute and other organizations. In many ways, it's a critical look at how that dialogue has gone. In particular, it's an argument to reorient the dialogue towards a much more embodied cognition framework away from a kind of brain-centered, in-the-head focus. That's one book that I'm trying to wrap up now. Another topic that I've been working on is really still in the early stages of writing. I've done a little bit of writing about this, and I've given some lectures about it in different places. It has to do with death and the human experience of dying, trying to look at that in light of our ever increasing biomedical knowledge of what happens to the brain and body in death, but also to bring a contemplative perspective to that scientific understanding. And that's in early stages of work. Those are the two main projects I would say that I'm working on right now.
It's so needed. Oh, I can't wait.
Obviously, it's a very difficult topic. It's a very important topic. And so I want to proceed in a way that's, let's say, careful and cautious with it and not to be too fast with it.
Well, let's launch here. I think you and I could probably agree that mainstream cognitive psychology is held fast to a dualistic, mechanistic image of the body as a passive machine controlled by an intelligent brain mind. Yes?
Yeah, I would say that that's a sort of default viewpoint. I think there are many people who, in cognitive psychology, who have a more sophisticated or a different view, more balanced view. But I think it's fair to say that that has been a default view for quite some time.
It seems like one antidote for this intractable mind-body split in Western neuroscience and cognitive psychology is embodied cognition. Just to define it for the listeners, it's a movement that recognizes that the whole body and its environment play crucial interactional roles with other cognitive processes in guiding human perception and action.
Mm-hmm.
You've played such a critical role for many years in promoting embodied cognition and the more recent explanatory model known as 4E cognition. This is very important for those of us who work somatically with patients in psychotherapy because we're continually using this capacity for interoception and proprioception as a way to land people in a state of being that is much healthier for them than the limited narrative that they're normally stuck in, which doesn't have much to do with bodily experience. So I thought we could begin by having you give a general description of the 4Es, and then we can explore each of the 4 a bit more deeply.
Okay, so the 4Es are embodied, emergent, extended, and inactive. There are other E's that some people sometimes throw into the mix, I should say, like, embedded. Some people also emphasize empathy as another E. So we can talk about these other ones in the mix. So embodied cognition is the idea that if we think about a cognitive process, take perception, for example, it's a whole body process. That is to say, it's not something that goes on inside the brain, though of course the brain is crucially important for it. It's something that has to do with the whole body in interaction with the environment. An analogy that I sometimes like to use is to say that cognition is like flight. So flight in the case of a bird, you need wings to fly, but flight isn't inside the wings. So you need a brain for cognition, but cognition isn't inside the brain. The wings facilitate flight, but flight is something that the whole bird does in active interaction with its environment. So cognition is something that the whole embodied person or animal does in interaction with the environment. And the brain, of course, is a crucial part of that, but it's kind of confused to think that it's something that's going on inside the brain. In a neuroimaging experiment, for example, we're not looking at cognition inside the brain. We're looking at how the brain is active given what the whole embodied person in a particular context is doing. So that's the basic idea of embodiment. There are ways to make it much more concrete and specific. If, say, for example, we're talking about vision, visual perception. Visual perception is not a passive process where you just pick up an image on the retina and then it's internally processed by the brain to generate some visual experience. Rather, at all stages, movement is crucially important. So movements of the eyes, movements of the head. And we know that you can change what people will report as their perception, even if you hold the stimulus fixed, depending on whether they're actively moving themselves in relationship to it or being passively moved in exactly the same ways. The signals that come about through the self-generation of movement actually affect what people perceive. And motor activity and parts of the body like the eyes and the head actually belong to what vision is as a process or activity. Vision isn't something that just happens in the visual cortex and other areas of the brain that take up signals from the visual cortex. So that would be a kind of concrete illustration of the idea of embodied cognition. There's recent research that shows that how you present visual stimuli in relationship to not just ongoing neural activity, but in relationship to heart rhythms actually affects how people are able to detect versus not detect a stimulus. So there's a lot of interest in the ways that cardiac and brain rhythms are coupled, not just for obvious medical reasons, but more generally in terms of understanding, say, how visual perception works. So that would be another example of kind of embodied cognition approach that's physiologically quite specific, actually. So that's the basic idea of embodiment.
For us, that would be vagal nerve mediated.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us who work somatically in psychotherapy, we're always interested in the kinesthetic body schemas, sensorimotor know-how, even bodily life regulation mechanisms, because these are all very important for cognition, for actually perceiving what's happening as it's actually happening, not some concept that the mind is coming up with based on either some kind of trauma memory or some habit of perception.
Right.
For me, this approach to cognition is saying that there's not just a body, there's actually a world. The world the being is in has a lot to do with how the being actually perceives that world.
Definitely. One example, I think, that's very related to that, this is actually something that my partner, Rebecca Todd, works on. So she's a cognitive neuroscientist who works on how affect influences attention. She talks about affect-biased attention. We have certain biases in the ways that we attend to things. For example, I tend to be kind of anxious before I give a lecture because of the anxiety, which is, felt viscerally and interoceptively. I have a sort of mental set for my anxiety, but I have certain body signals, and they, of course, reciprocally reinforce each other. And so that's going to make my attention more drawn to faces in the audience that I'm going to read as, oh, they're not really interested in what I have to say, or they think what I say is wrong, or something like that. And that whole selective attending to neutral faces or faces that might look irritated versus happy faces has to do with my mental disposition to be anxious, but also the way that, these internal body signals of increased vigilance or metabolic activity that's required for the energy to give a lecture. Of course, I interpret that in a way that's going to reinforce the anxiety, and that's going to make me attend. And then the attending to those things reinforces the feeling. So it's a world, body, mind in the sense of one's cognitive frame kind of loop that goes back and forth and back and forth. As you know, obviously, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, different kinds of therapeutic and meditative practices work with getting you not to identify with that as, how you are and how things are.
It's a really good example that you give, also because it really points to the problem with the way psychological science has viewed an experience like that. For those of us who are clinicians, when we hear a description like that from a patient, the first thing we think of is, oh, this person is paying more attention to the story, what's happening, and not what's actually happening, which are these social sensorimotor interactions.
Right. Right.
And that's part of social cognition. So there's actually a group of people, especially you, Evan, when people come to hear you, believe me, they don't think you're anxious because they just know what they're about to get is going to be amazing. So they're all just excited. I doubt you could possibly find one face in the audience who seems uninterested and bored because...
And yet we have these scripts that are these narratives, as you say, and that's what we often run on.
The 4 E's are a wonderful way for us to land ourselves as clinicians. And yes, you can allow your patient to be more attentive to the actual stimuli that are there rather than their notions about what's there, which, of course, as you say, has everything to do with contemplative practice.
Right.
In many ways. Do you think we have any more clarity at this point about the meaning and processes and mechanisms of embodiment?
There's a lot of different work that's being done that's very illuminating. I think with a concept like embodiment, it's very rich. And so it really demands a lot of different investigative perspectives. The examples that I was just giving, kind of coming from more traditional cognitive science, there's been a real development of findings and techniques and methods and theoretical frameworks within cognitive science for thinking about embodied cognition. One of the things that I think is unique about the embodied cognition movement is that it brings in perspectives also from anthropology and from developmental psychology, from philosophy, and does so in a way that I think is integrative without really trying to reduce any one perspective to the others. And I think that's a methodological progress in itself. The ways that historians have looked at different body practices and ways of conceiving the body in different cultures and different historical epochs, that's also been very important in the general development of the embodied cognition framework. It's a very good time for this kind of research.
Let's talk about embedded. I really like embedded.
Mm-hmm.
Cognition in general is always relative to a specific organism and concrete situations, cultures, and technologies. And the embodied mind doesn't exist in isolation from its environment. It's always embedded. And it pretty much lives, I think, in a world that's sort of co-defined by bodily capacities and goal-directedness. We're very goal-directed animals. We could extend this conversation, I think, to more biological processes, cells.
Yeah.
This is a great thing for you, maybe to explain to the listeners embeddedness and extendedness and sort of intelligence in all biological processes. Many people in psychology think we're the only animals, or we're the only living species, or we're the only living entity that has these capacities and goal-directedness. I've learned from you that's not true. But for humans, these things provide meaning and relationality to our perceptions, and we are social animals. And in fact, you stated all animal life is about coupling and co-regulation.
So within the idea of embodiment already is this idea of embeddedness. The thing that's being emphasized is the way that when we talk about the body, we are immediately talking about an environment, a milieu or a niche or a context. And that context isn't an indifferent external setting. It's a context that has the contours that it has because of the presence of a body in it. And the body is the way that it is because of its presence in that context. So they are co-determining, or they're coupled in that way. The environment attracts us in particular ways. It affords certain possibilities for action. And that has to do with the kinds of bodily beings we are. Embeddedness really refers to that way of thinking about the environment as intimately coupled to the body. And that is true for all biological life. A bacterial colony, the cells are metabolically self-renewing and self-generating, and they are that way in a certain chemical environment, and the chemical environment is the way that it is, in part because of the metabolic activity of the bacteria. So that's just a basic feature of life at the ground floor level. What's special about the animal way of doing this in general is that animal life involves multicellularity, so it involves a complex body with many parts that have to be held together in a particular way. And that's partly the job of the nervous system, is to hold the body together because it's actively moving around the environment. The body has to regulate itself in its movement. And of course, the nervous system is involved in that as well. But in the case of human life, as you say, we're social, and our environment is a social environment, an environment of joint cooperative activities in which we regulate each other's attention, and we recognize how we attend to things in terms of eye movements and head movements. We're constantly modulating each other's activity. And then, of course, there's language. Language gives us the concepts within which we're able to categorize the world in certain ways and conceive of certain things. So all of that context is the way that we're embedded in the world. That's something that the embodied cognition approach especially emphasizes, that the world in which we're embedded is not just an independent outside world, but it's a world that is the way that it is because of how we are and the kinds of things that we're able to do.
Of course, that takes us to extended. Living in Silicon Valley,
right.
We're particularly interested in, especially in this age of devices and
Right.
VR technology, where we draw the boundaries of mind and cognitive capacities. It really profoundly impacts us. And I don't think this is just philosophical speculation, frankly.
No, I don't think so either. So extension is the idea that there are things that we make, artifacts, tools, technologies, and they extend our bodily and cognitive abilities. When they do so in a way where there's an intimate coupling with the activity of the body and these kind of dense circular causal feedback loops, those tools actually become part of our extended cognitive system. Writing, if we want to speak historically, is an example of this. Computers and computational technologies extend our cognitive capacities in whole new ways. Distributed networks of information and things like the internet. All of that falls under the heading of extended cognition.
I'm not sure this is correct, at least psychologically speaking. Extended mind to me has everything to do with the nervous system, especially in terms of social cognition and relational presence. I think mental health professionals are very aware of how the quality of presencing another can really empower or impede a therapeutic intervention. And in some ways, I experience the extendedness in terms of cognition as a body wisdom, that there's wisdom that the organism has that very often we modern humans don't actually experience directly or even participate in. Sometimes we don't even know that this complex machine that is our body, our nervous system, has all these ways of relating to its environment that feel very connected. That connectedness for me has a lot to do with the extended quality of cognition.
The body, the human organism, is constantly adapting an adaptive system. You could say is highly plastic, so it can modify its activity and its structure in all sorts of ways in relationship to the environment. And some of those can be beneficial and some of those can be deleterious depending on the context. Whether we categorize them as, mental illness or physical illness, bodily illness, are ways that whole embodied being or person is adaptively altering in relationship to the environment. I mean, one way to think about it is in terms of the idea, not so much of extension, but of incorporation in the literal sense of taking something into the body. So a blind person, this is an example that comes from both from Gregory Bateson, systems thinker, and also from Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a phenomenological philosopher, that when the blind person uses a cane, the blind person doesn't feel the cane, they feel the world, and they feel through the cane to the world. So the cane is literally incorporated it's taken up into the body because the body has this adaptive power to assimilate things in that way.
So we just dipped our toe in the last of the four E's, inactive, which to me is the most interesting one. Some of the embodied proposals really rest on this inactive view of cognition as dependent upon a living, autonomous bodily system that continually regenerates material and energy exchanges, despite all the variations that may be existing in it and around it. And then that second piece is that it recognizes itself, is distinguishable from its surroundings. So it knows itself, it knows its surroundings, and it has this, what Francisco coined the term autopoiesis to describe this self-organizing logic. You've suggested that autopoietic processes are dependent on the health of its network. And you also call it precarious, entangled, maintaining modifications. To me, this sounds like homeostasis.
Yeah.
But it also seems extremely important these days when our world environment is in such a precarious situation. I don't know if you heard, it was 106 degrees today in Tokyo.
And the humidity must be amazing. So let me just start with the idea of enaction. So enaction is the term that Francisco Varela coined and that we used in our book, The Embodied Mind, also written with Eleanor Roche. The idea was really to say that cognition is a matter of acting in the world, not representing it in the head, especially where representing means there is a way that the world is independently of us outside there, and the job of cognition is to correctly represent that world. And we talked about enaction as the bringing forth of a world, or the bringing forth of meaning, or a sense of what's relevant in and through embodied action. Autopoiesis was a term that Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana introduced to talk about the basic nature of life and the biological sense of life, that life is self-making. So it's auto is the self part and poiesis is the making part from the Greek. So life is always self-constructing, self-making, self-generating, and you need that for enaction. So enaction requires that the system, the cognitive agent or the cognitive being, have this self-generative, self-making organization or capacity, because that's where meaning comes from. Meaning comes when you have a system and something matters for its flourishing or it challenges it, and it constantly has to negotiate the world through its ongoing task, as it were, of self-construction. They use the word autopoiesis as the name for this at the most basic level of a cell. A cell synthesizes itself out of its own ongoing activity in relationship to the environment. So the idea of precariousness is that this is always precarious in the sense that you have a self-producing network, if you want to call it that, and the things that make up the network are bound up with each other in such a way that if they weren't bound up in that way, things would run down, they would atrophy, they would dissipate. So the whole system has to hold itself together in relationship to its world. And precariousness is that this is always, in a sense, being buffeted or challenged, requires adaptivity, self-maintenance and regulation. And this is basic to life in general, though, of course, for us, it has this social embeddedness. So it is, in a way, a kind of homeostasis, except, or you might say homeodynamics, actually. The crucial difference with the sort of general notion of homeostasis is that homeostasis just generally refers to, maintaining something within some range through a corrective or a feedback mechanism. Whereas the critical variable that's got to be held within a certain range, in the case of autopoiesis, is the system itself. It's transient identity as a being or as an agent. That's the thing that has to be constantly dynamically maintained.
It's interesting because to me, this just slipped over into philosophy.
Right.
Partly because when I think of humans as we are now, I feel like we're very confused about ourselves. We're very confused about why we're here and our relationship to our environment because we're so disconnected in so many ways. And I feel like it's very difficult for us to stay healthy. I don't make this distinction between mental illness, physical illness to me.
Sure.
And I think actually medicine is coming around to this viewpoint. Right. They're very fond now of calling everything an inflammatory disease. Only 23% of our DNA is human. The rest of it is bacterial. So our posture as this intelligent, beyond anything else, all-knowing, almost godlike species, it's causing us to have some trouble with what you name as the two key characteristics of autonomous organismic systems: capacity for adaptivity and sense-making. We humans are very good at sense-making. We'll connect dots where there aren't any to try to make sense of something that makes no sense. I feel like at a cellular level, there's the quality of biological sense-making that we are no longer doing.
This connects in a way to the question of identity and the self. I've been talking up to this point as if, the body is this thing that has a certain kind of self-identity. That's certainly true. On one level, we can talk about the body as this, metabolically self-generative system that keeps itself going as a particular bounded, permeable structure in relationship to the environment. But then if we look a little closer and we ask, well, what is the body? As you say, there's the DNA that we get from our parents, but then there's all the microbiome and the gut bacteria and all the bacteria on our skin. They are us in one sense because they are beings that make us be the beings we are. But of course, genetically, they're not us, and organismically, they have their own status. There are at all levels, up and down and in and out, there are these interdependent networks. And it's the interdependent networks that are the processes that we have to really attend to if we want to understand something like sense making or something like identity. There's the sense making that happens when you're thinking and trying to figure something out in that way. And then there's the sense making that's an immediate, visceral, interoceptive response to something that you subliminally perceive in your environment. And then there's the sense making that has to do with mood, which is very much dependent on, as we're increasingly learning, things like the gut biome. So sense making, just like inaction, just like autopoiesis, these are very general terms we use to talk about these things. But then when we want to get specific, we have to go into these networks of processes and really look at the fine detail.
How do you think psychology would change if it embraced embodied cognition?
There's psychology in the sense of clinical psychology, and there's psychology in the sense of cognitive psychology. And then there's how those two fields talk to each other. It's kind of a big question across the whole range of things. Cognitive psychology has certainly been very brain focused. And indeed, the very distinction between psychology and biology is a distinction that's, when we're talking about the kinds of things that we're talking about, very hard to draw. So, we have these institutional distinctions that we make in university departments or we make in fields of research. And those distinctions really don't always work for the kinds of things we're trying to map. So I see the embodied cognition approach as forcing us to really cut across those kinds of divisions and distinctions and to break down certain kinds of categories that might not be helpful, and then to try to build up other ones that, because we're always going to be dealing with some categories or other and concepts, we can't get outside of that, but to build up others that might help us more, getting away from a very brain-centered focus not making the distinction between body and mind or between biology and cognition. Those are, in very general terms, some of the things that have already been happening. Integrative thinking is what's called for. And that's hard because we don't teach it.
You're probably aware none of this is taught in clinical programs.
Yes.
Well, let's switch gears a little. You're a man of many talents, as we've already seen, and areas of inquiry. And one of which is your incredible contributions to what's now known as contemplative science. In 2016, you gave a keynote at ISCS where you said, I'm going to quote you, I hope this isn't embarrassing. You said, the deep existential and spiritual crisis of our scientific culture is that we constantly forget that lived experience is the source of science and its ground of validity. And you went on to say, mindfulness is not in the head. Being mindful is an embodied social practice, not a private mental state or a special pattern of brain activity. Mindfulness is embodied understanding. I was hoping you'd be willing to elaborate. And I think it's also a corrective to what you call the ill-conceived internalist view of the neuroscientific study of mindfulness.
Yeah, so this is very much connected to all the things we've been talking about up to this point. That talk was really a call to reorient how we think about mindfulness practices and how we research them. The reason that I wanted to do this is because the scientific study of mindfulness practices has been very dominated by the idea that what we need to do is we need to find out what the neural substrates or the neural correlates or the neural systems in the brain are for different aspects of mindfulness practice, attention and meta-awareness and emotion regulation, that's the proper scientific level at which to investigate mindfulness. My concern was that in thinking about it that way, it very easily leads one into thinking that what mindfulness is about is a practice that goes on inside the individual head, that neuroscience gives us the real scientific window onto that. There were two ways in which I criticized that. So they are practices that involve cultivating certain habits of attention, cultivating certain habits of meta-awareness, and cultivating certain habits of dealing with emotions. They involve the whole person in relationship to the person's environment, including the social environment. We see this already in the canonical presentation of mindfulness in the early Buddhist sutta, the setting up or the establishment of mindfulness, where mindfulness is a practice that has to do with how you orient your attention and your thought and your awareness to certain things in a particular world, with a particular worldview, and in a particular social setting, which actually in the context of that discourse happened to be a monastic social setting. Of course, for us, mindfulness is now something that that we see as having secular dimensions. The analogy I used was mindfulness is a social skill. It's like parenting. If you think about what parenting is part of our biology. We are mammals. It comes with the kind of beings that we are as biological creatures, but it's a social practice done in different ways in different communities, and this is constantly changing. So if you want to understand what parenting is, and indeed what good parenting is, you have to look especially at the social context. So similarly, mindfulness, I want to say, is a skill that has a social dimension. And if you want to understand what it is, you have to look at the social context in the way that you would in the case of parenting. So the idea that parenting is in the head, everybody would say, well, of course you need a brain and you need, to think in the right ways, and you need empathy and perspective taking and all those cognitive abilities to be a good parent. But parenting isn't in the head. It's a relationship between you and your child. Similarly, mindfulness, you need cognitive capacities like attention and perspective taking and empathy and emotion regulation for the full suite of mindfulness practices. But it's not something that's going on in the head. It's something that you are enacting in the social setting. And then the second point was to say, to understand mindfulness in that way, you need an embodied cognition approach. Just looking at what's going on inside the brain, just as looking inside the brain and seeing what lights up when someone is responding empathetically to a child might tell you something about the brain systems that are needed for empathy. It doesn't actually tell you much about parenting because you can't see parenting at that level of a brain scan. So similarly, yes, when you see certain things are active in the brain, when someone is practicing, say, a mindfulness of breathing, that does tell you something about what's going on in the brain when you engage in that practice, but it's actually not illuminating on its own about what the practice is. To understand that, you need an embodied cognition perspective. So that was basically the argument. It was an attempt to sort of reorient the science of mindfulness into an embodied cognition, an active cognition paradigm. And I think that's especially important because, and this was also something I talked about, thinking of the individual and in the head fits very well with our consumerist capitalist culture, which mindfulness practices have been complicit in various ways. Mindfulness is being commodified. And so if we just line up mindfulness in the head with the neuroscience approach with the consumerist capitalist culture in which we find ourselves, then we actually reinforce precisely what, from a larger perspective, the mindfulness practices are, at least according to one ethical framework that I would uphold, are meant to actually help liberate us from, actually, to put it strongly.
I think this is really important for psychotherapists in clinical psychology and therapeutic interventional psychology. Really has suffered from the same problem, I think. You're in the room with one person. It's all about them. It's about all their problems. Nobody's really talking about the world and the collective difficulties. It's almost like mindfulness came into a sick system, and the study of mindfulness has suffered from this view, which is so ill-conceived, at least to me.
You know, it's funny because in some ways it's a new version of an old argument. You know, I remember when I was a kid in the 60s and in the 70s listening to the arguments adults around me would have. And back then it was, I mean, to put it simplistically, it was kind of like Freud versus Marx. So, you know, Freud is all about excavating the unconscious and recovering the id and personal transformation. And Marx is all about, yeah, you can do that in the privacy of your relationship with your therapist on the couch, and it's not going to change the larger social structures. And the Freudians say back to the Marxists, yeah, but you can go out and try to change the social structures. But if you haven't dealt with your own internal psychic dynamics, you're just going to perpetuate them out there. In the mindfulness community, it's a similar discussion, this idea that we need to deal with our individual psychological function, but we also need to look at the larger context. And of course, it's not an either or. I mean, you have to address both, and they mutually reinforce each other. And this, again, is, I think, where the embodied cognition and embedded cognition perspective is useful, because it points to how our individual minds are shaped by the larger context, but also how the larger context is the way it is because of how our individual minds work. And the mindfulness research in science and the mindfulness discourse, I would say, in popular culture, has tended to really slide towards the in-the-head way of thinking about it.
I'll just play devil's advocate for a minute, just because it's fun. If you look at the Pali Canon, there are many suttas in the Pali Canon where the Buddha basically instructs the monks to go under a tree and do jhana practice. For those of you who are unaware, jhana practice is a very specific concentration practice in which there is greater and greater and greater internalizing and losing your experience of the world to the point where all there is just the ground of awareness. Then there is no world anymore. He would say for them to go do this in order to create a pliable mind, to have some level of samadhi, so that then they could do insight practice about the nature of existence.
Right.
So doesn't this just sound completely contrary to embodied cognition and embodied mindfulness?
Right. That's a complicated question. It's complicated both in terms of how do we want to think about those different concentrative and insight practices in relationship to the embodied cognition viewpoint. And then it's a complicated question in terms of different ways of interpreting what's going on in the different Buddhist texts. And this is actually something that I'm writing about in this book that I talked about the Buddhism science discussion way back at the beginning of our conversation. You know, it's important to remind people what we have that we think of as the Buddha's teachings are texts that were written down several centuries after the Buddha lived in a place far from where he lived, and that already contain an attempt to put together divergent understandings of what his teaching was. One of the tensions is, what's the relationship between these intense concentration practices where you enter these states of meditative absorptions, the jhanas, where as you go progressively deeper, more and more things fall away. There's initially a feeling of bliss, but then the bliss falls away. There's a falling away of any subject-object distinction. The world is no longer present. The sense of the body is no longer there. There's an absorption in what's called simply the sphere of nothingness. And then there's the emphasis on understanding insight, which requires a cognitive framework that you understand that things are impermanent, that everything that we latch onto and think of as a self is transitory and doesn't really meet the criteria of being a self. Transitory things are suffering because of how we experience them as not transitory. And so this requires a kind of very sophisticated conceptual philosophical understanding that you can internalize so that have it as sort of directly how you see things, but that initially, at any rate, is conceptual. And so then what's the relationship between these two with regard to the Buddhist path of ultimate liberation, the release from suffering? Is it that you need this intense meditative concentrative stabilization in order to have the penetrating insight? Or can you, as it were, go for the penetrating insight without going all the way down the path of the meditative absorption? Because it's the insight that really is supposed to be ultimately generative of liberation. So there's this tension already in the earliest Buddhist materials that we have. Well, what's the relationship of that whole complicated discussion to embodied cognition? There's in a way not one answer to that. I think it sort of depends what we're talking about. The practices of stabilizing attention and generating deep meditative concentration are, from an embodied cognition perspective, very much embodied cognition practices, even if they lead to a dissolution of a sense of awareness of body versus world. In order to understand, the need to place the body in a certain position, the need to hold the breath or to hold awareness to the breath in a certain way. We can't really understand that except from a somatic framework. Similarly, practices of developing insight, those require a community in the traditional setting of monastics that support each other, that have a shared understanding of teachings. So, the embodied, embedded, and active perspective, I think, works very well to talk about how that functions from the outside, from a kind of cognitive science perspective. So all of this is to say, I don't see these things as contradictory. As a philosopher, I like to see disagreements. I like to see different perspectives. When these things come up in dialogues with the Dalai Lama and scientists, I find them extremely interesting because we can't rest in knowing that one worldview or one theoretical framework can just be taken for granted. Everything is up for discussion.
That's why I like the neurophenomenological approach to consciousness. Because even if you're doing a concentrated practice where the brain is not receiving information anymore from the body, it's still a brain. It's still a body. To me, there's still something embodied, even in what seemingly appear to be bodiless states of consciousness.
Yes, so there is where I think a phenomenological perspective is important. And this has to do with the primacy of lived experience that you mentioned earlier on. So from a phenomenological perspective, what we do is we bracket certain kinds of, let's call them metaphysical questions. And we try to reorient our attention simply to how things show up for us experientially. And so when we talk about meditation practices, from that perspective, we're interested in the range of phenomenological experiences or states. Bodiless there in a phenomenological context doesn't necessarily mean there's no body in the sense of no living body. It means that the experience may not be characterized by any kind of bodily awareness. And that seems entirely an open possibility, that there can be experiences in which any sense of bodily presence is either absent or is highly altered or highly attenuated. Now, if we then want to make an inference to saying, well, metaphysically, that means there can be consciousness without a body, that doesn't follow logically, and it's a different kind of state. And then a neurophenomenological approach is one that does that in the context of a neuroscience investigation of embodied awareness or consciousness.
Do you think this is how the primacy of consciousness and the primacy of embodiment work together? In our dualistic frame, people would just think that can't be.
When I say the primacy of consciousness, what I mean is that everything we do, including when we do science, we do as conscious beings within a space of meaning that isn't there unless consciousness is there. So we never step outside consciousness. Science requires observation. It requires communities of conscious subjects. It requires measurement, but you have to read the measurement as a conscious observer. So consciousness is always there. It's the kind of backdrop against which we're able to bring anything into focus as an investigation. So it's never the case in science, even when we're doing the science of consciousness, that we can sort of get outside consciousness. At the same time, whenever we're investigating consciousness, we never find it showing up apart from some context of embodiment. From an investigative perspective, we're dealing with an embodied, living, breathing human subject who makes a report. We never find consciousness just as it were just sort of floating there by itself. We always find it grounded and embodied.
Except many of the Eastern religious traditions and yogic traditions and Buddhist traditions, they're always positing a ground of consciousness that is beyond subjectivity. It's not dependent.
Right. So that's where we're getting into the areas where I think there's interesting friction between different worldviews and perspectives. So some Eastern traditions, not all actually, but some assert that what has primacy, not just, you could say, phenomenologically in a very rich sense of that word, but also metaphysically or ontologically in terms of being, is consciousness, pure awareness or pristine awareness. I would say that from a philosophical and scientific perspective, I have no problem with that statement as a phenomenological report about there being certain levels or depths of awareness that seem different from the sort of episodic transitory workings of the cognitive mind. But the further inference that this is fundamentally the nature of the universe at its most primal ground, that to me is a statement that doesn't logically follow from the phenomenological sense of the statement. Those traditions involves a lot of other things, a lot of other philosophical ideas, and also you could say rhetorical ideas that have to do with certain kinds of worldviews, certain kinds of practices. I'm not dismissive in the sense of, I think that's false. I think that it has a different status from the phenomenological statement. And I don't see the phenomenological statement as necessitating the metaphysical or ontological one. The metaphysical or ontological one is kind of an open question for me.
I know we like to think we know everything, but
the open question should sometimes be left open.
They are the ground of mental health.
To be able to leave a question open and be comfortable with that is a sign of resiliency, among other things.
We've touched here on liberation in the Buddhist sense, and you and I are both very interested in and have both written about I-making and the problem of I-making, as an ego. I think it was the talk at Dartmouth that you gave. At one point, you said the absence in Buddhism, the absence at the heart of presence is emptiness. I've never heard anybody describe emptiness so eloquently.
Oh, thank you. I was thinking very much, I think, of Madhyamaka, middle way Buddhist philosophy, and Nagarjuna when I said that statement. Also, maybe some ways that's rendered in Chan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism.
For clinicians, that's a practical statement because that heart of presence actually is an absence that is completely interconnected and interdependent. And when you describe emptiness this way, you can look at liberation as something other than just getting rid of the ego or getting rid of a sense of self, which of course you and I both know liberation is not about that. Even though people may have the feeling of that either in meditative practice or as a result in their life. Maybe you would just say a little bit about liberation and its relationship to shifting one's view about this egoic function of I-making and the trouble that it gets us into personally and collectively.
Let me say first, actually, so I-making is a term that I'm using as a rendering of an Indian, South Asian philosophical idea that comes from the Sankhya and yoga tradition. So the idea of ahamkara, the idea that there is, as part of being an embodied being, there is, if you will, a performance or a function of constructing a sense of self and a sense of identity. And different traditions then view that in different ways. Some say, well, that's exactly the problem. And it's a kind of conceit and it has to be let go of, it has to be overcome. One has to attain liberation from that. And other traditions say, no, that in and of itself is okay. It's the mistake that's made of thinking that there is a real self in it that's the ground of it, and that is giving you some kind of ego reference point around which you should organize your view of everything. And that's actually more what the problem is. And that's in a way more how I am inclined to think of it. We have a sense of self in the sense of an ego, a waking sense of self that we also key into dreams, that involves autobiographical memory and involves projecting yourself into the future, and involves your sense of being, one individual in relationship to other individuals. You can try to see yourself from their perspective and so on. That sort of sense of social ego self. I see that as a construction. It's constructed in all sorts of ways through the biology of our bodies. It's constructed historically. It's constructed socially. I don't see it as being really fundamentally an illusion. I see it as a construct that's useful, but it can also become dysfunctional, and it can get in the way if it's not functioning in healthy and appropriate ways. Today, there's an emphasis on the idea that it's nothing but an illusion that is especially reinforced by this individualist neuroscience view that we were talking about before. The idea that, so we go inside the brain and we don't see that there's any one system that's a self system, or there is no self in the brain. There's just all these different cognitive networks. And so the sense that there's a self, that's an illusion. I don't think that's quite the right way of talking about it. What our brains and bodies do in the environment is participate in constructing a sense of self. And that's crucial. I mean, how could you have autobiographical memory or plan for the future or think of yourself as a member of a community in relation to others if there wasn't that kind of, functional sense of self? The attachment to it, though, the overinvestment in it, the prioritizing of it as somehow special and different from all the other ones that are there, that I think is what the problem is.
So what would that look like?
Which,
if you were not reifying your separate individual self as though it is the core of everything you are, how would you relate differently to your life experience?
I don't think there's any one answer to that. I think it depends on conceptual and ethical frameworks. Those are going to differ in different communities and for different cultures. But we could say in general, one would not be habitually orienting everything in one's thinking around an ultimate privileging of I, me, mine. But how that sort of manifests on the ground or how that manifests behaviorally, I think that really depends on the context. In a traditional society with very well-defined social roles, it might take one form. In a society with a lot more fluidity about social roles and identity, it might take different forms. I don't think there's any sort of ahistorical kind of pure answer to that question. That said, I also think that we have certain responsibilities to each other, and we have certain responsibilities to the world in which we find ourselves. And the way that Asian religious traditions were fetishized and exoticized and, brought into a very affluent way of life, from the perspective of social history and social change, that's social political dynamic that has to be addressed at that level. It can't be addressed just at the level of, how it feels to be in your meditation room meditating.
So as a philosopher, would you say that liberation from ignorant form of self-making is a necessary condition for mental health?
So I'm a little cautious in using the term liberation, just because it's very loaded in any particular, Buddhist or Hindu context, if it's being used to kind of render one of those traditional notions, or in terms of Western political thinking. Certainly, it's a condition of more wholesome ways of life in relationship to each other and in relationship to the larger environment, that a self-centered perspective be overcome. And I actually think that meditation practice is not necessarily what's most important there. Most important are things like less inequity between poor and wealthy, more social justice, community building, because those create, through connectivity and connection, a less self-centered perspective. And unless you have a certain baseline of that, then the meditation doesn't really matter, it seems to me. Unless you're going to become a monastic and you're going to renounce, because traditionally that is a route that's taken.
And yet I would say that model existed because the community was actually supporting them financially.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And so in a way, this just goes back to autopoiesis. You just have this networked environment that's making it possible so the Sangha doesn't die.
Right. And the Sangha, in the sense of the monastic community, arises at times of increased mercantilism and wealth and, changes in society.
Anybody who works with depression, if you get your patient to start doing things for other people, volunteering, they will immediately start feeling better. And they will not be lost in this self-centered depressive narrative.
I've seen this in my students. I've seen it in my own kids who are adults now. Some of the challenges that are from the clinical psychology perspective put in the mental health category, things like anxiety and depression, those have a lot to do with how people are trying to fit into a system that actually isn't a great system. It's not to say it's a panacea fix all, but sometimes really changing, establishing a sense of community, or, not living in a really stressful urban environment, but trying to, change and live in other contexts. For some people, that actually, it makes a huge difference. I'm not a therapist, so I have no sense of how one as a therapist would work with this dimension, but it just seems to me that part of figuring out how to be healthy in the world is knowing when this is not a context in which I should be trying to internally readapt myself to it. That certainly speaks to the need to work towards making other kinds of structural possibilities available to people that seem increasingly few in our world.
It's true. But again, this is just another one of those ways in which psychology becomes an agent for keeping people not making the change in the world that needs to be made. Wow, we've gone all over the place today.
Yes, we have. I hope that's useful.
It's been incredible. If the listeners want to find out more about you and your work, where do they go?
Probably the best place is my website, which is just evanthompson.me. That has my writings and information about my activities and things like that. There's a bunch of different lectures that I've given that are in YouTube, like the one you mentioned. It's really about mindfulness practices.
Thank you so much, Evan.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's show. The Groundless Ground podcast is now available on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. To find out more about this episode, see a list of upcoming guests, or get in touch, visit groundlessground.com. Now let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.